We're here today with Dr. Carlos Sluzki, a professor with the Institute for Conflict Analysis and Resolution and the College of Health and Human Services Department of Global Community and Health at George Mason University. He is a specialist of psychiatry and an expert in human rights and refugee issues. Thanks for joining us, Dr. Sluzki.
It's a pleasure.
There are more than 2 million Iraqis living in exile in neighboring countries, and almost 2 million more are internally displaced. This represents nearly 1 in 6 Iraqis, and many more remain at home, foregoing work, school, and shopping, and sleep in different places at night. Can you speak to the psychological effects of life under these circumstances?
Well, the life of a refugee is a life that, first of all, implies a loss of the social network that gives them a sense of community and of being part of whatever environment they are. They are disconnected frequently from the extended family. They are disconnected from any kind of potential services, from health to education, and so they live in a sort of limbo. The other reality is that once a refugee displaces into a new country, which is really the definition across international boundaries, they don't know for how long. Each time they assume they may be there for a month and then return, 2 months and then return, and they may be there for years. And during all these years, their future projects, their prospection is completely suspended, and they live, as it happens with many of the, for instance, Palestinian refugees, that they have been living for 30 years in Lebanon, and they still are refugees. They still are people from other countries. Many of them may have been born there, and nonetheless, they maintain this status of being but not being there, and longing for a country that since long may have disappeared, at least in many senses. So, psychological impact, you ask, and there are many layers of psychological impact, from these collective issues to the single individual that is that doesn't have the possibility of specific project for their own lives.
Are the dynamics more or less the same for those that are internally displaced?
From a certain perspective, the situation of the internally displaced is better because they are in a milieu that is more or less recognizable, and it is worse because there are many fewer organizations that take care of internally displaced than refugees. Refugees, for instance, have been for many years the center of attention of the United Nations High Commission on Refugees, in addition to many other NGOs. Internally displaced only last year became the charge of the UNHCR, and they are still scrambling, trying to figure out how to deal with this doubling the population of which they are responsible, for which they don't have an increased budget, for instance. So from that perspective, internally displaced people are frequently more orphaned of any kind of external assistance. They are sometimes, or not infrequently, better in terms of at least maintaining connection with the old space and recognizing somehow the clues of their culture.
What more can be done to support the needs of the IDPs, given the inability of international humanitarian organizations to operate safely in Iraq?
Well, as with public health, the main issue is prevention. What can we do? What we have to do is stop meddling in their affairs and transforming the enormous budget that we are spending into weapons and things like that into services to reconstitute at least the basic infrastructure of that society and allow them to do it. And in that case, the probability of their returning to the place of origin is greater. In the meanwhile, your guess is as good as mine. It is an extremely dangerous territory for other organizations to support them, support the internally displaced people, and even United Nations agencies are very cautious and minimally able to displace. So I don't have a good answer to that spinous question. Tricky question. How does spinous means? Tricky question. That's it.
A bipartisan group in the Senate has introduced a resolution calling for the easing of immigration restrictions on Iraqis who have worked with the U.S. government and therefore face reprisals from Iraqi insurgents. Currently, only 1,750 Iraqis are expected to be admitted into the U.S. out of the 10,000 referred by the United Nations and a target of 7,000 per year. What does this increased willingness to accept refugees represent? And does this have any significant impact on the more than 4 million Iraqis that have been displaced?
The impact is minimal indeed, but in addition to that, I'm not sure it's an increase because there was, in theory at least, a quota of 7,000 that was defined by the US government in terms of their acceptance of Iraqis. And so the figure of 1,700 is much below what is expected. And if you compare it with Sweden, that has, 10 times the number of Iraqis accepted as refugees, it's a minimal amount. Not to mention the fact that it is a pitiful description of a reality. It reminds me this, imagine, these are the people that we expected them to receive us as liberators and etc., etc. Now they have to escape their own country because they are afraid of reprisals because of their any kind of connection with us. That tells the world a lot about what were we doing there. It reminds me a bit of the saving distance in many senses, the monks that after the Vietnam War, they had to escape, what was it, northern Laos, because they were considered they were considered part of allies of the U.S. War efforts in Vietnam, because these are animist, primitive tribes in northern Laos, was it, or Cambodia, probably Laos, and they were paid by the CIA to inform them when the Ho Chi Minh Trail was active, etc. So these people were an extreme danger, and so that extreme danger, they came as refugees to the U.S., mainly settling in the West Coast and the central part of the U.S., and they were for, like, I don't know, 5 layers of acculturation, distant from anything that was recognizable for them. The comparison also suffers differently because Iraqis were much more sophisticated. I don't want to compare Iraqis with monks, but both are situations of people who, by being allied to the US, ended up having to escape their own country.